Okay, I think it gives you enough. All right. Welcome to Life's Not Linear, episode 55. Today, for the first time, I'm interviewing two guests together. Please take a moment to each introduce yourselves. Zach, why don't you start?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Zech Dahms, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin here, and grew up in Oconomowoc, but really just focusing on cultural design and architecture at this point and within the community.
Awesome. Aneysha?
So my name's Aneysha Bhat. I'm originally from Naperville, Illinois. I've been in Milwaukee for about 4 years now. And my background's in engineering, but I'm really interested in cultural engineering. So how do we bring culture and organizational strategy here to the city?
That's awesome. I'm super excited to talk to you both and see your individual paths and then how those intersected as well. So Zach, we'd go back to you. If you could give me a bit more of your background, whether maybe starting from college and what you studied and here, that'd be great.
I think like most people, I've gone through my own transitions throughout the last 10 years. So I moved into Milwaukee in 2010, started my undergrad at UW-Milwaukee, and had a focus on finance and marketing. And at that time, I was also working at the UWM Rec Center and worked pretty actively with student involvement too. So that was kind of like my first experience with like program management and doing events and programs with students. And then as I finished up my undergrad, I had the opportunity to become a building manager there and also go back for my graduate program and get my MBA in organizational design. So I did that for 2 years through the program. And then from there, I was approached by a fairly large software company here headquartered in Wauwatosa, Zywave, which is a great company, quick plug-in for them. And they approached me to become a sales account executive there. And I've always kind of been super interested and intrigued in sales. And a lot of my old mentors kind of talked about how valuable of a skill it is to learn and understand. So I left my kind of like original passion of like student involvement and program management and working with the community and entered into the corporate space for a little bit. So as I finished up my MBA, I started my career at Zywave. So since then, I've been there for 5 years now and have worked in a pretty diverse amount of roles, whether that is more of a solo like sales account executive position to a few leadership positions to even being like a solutions architect, which they call that in the software space, where you're basically doing discovery work with your customers to understand their problems and then working with your engineers internally to co-create kind of the next evolution of your solution for them. But while that was going on, I've always been still involved in the social sector and working with nonprofits and different organizations in Milwaukee, like New Milwaukee and the Commons. They always have those like accelerators and different programs that they're doing. So I've been pretty active with them. And that's where some of my passion for design thinking and system thinking started to grow. And I started to get more involved with actually implementing those things into the community and with companies. Which kind of brought where Aneysha and I are today and launching Perrenial Culture. I've been doing it kind of as a passion project for the last 3 years, but more formally now this year of doing like cultural system design. So it's been kind of a crazy 10 years, but it's been exciting to say the least. Yeah.
That's awesome. I love that you've always kind of kept that sense of community. That's great to see during like your not always linear path.
Yeah, definitely was something that's like, I think I ignored it for a little bit and I realized that I was like, okay, I'm not that happy during that time. So I was like, okay, maybe I should get back involved with it, you know?
That makes sense. Aneysha, could you also give us a bit of your background?
Yeah, for sure. So my background is actually in biomedical engineering. I graduated as an engineer and I started in the corporate world as a product development engineer. And through that experience, I realized, I had some good experiences, I had some bad experiences. And so I was up in Appleton, Wisconsin. And I realized that, okay, the culture of a small town, maybe not for me. So I need to try to move somewhere else. And so I moved to Milwaukee and I started at GE Healthcare, where I'm currently still at. And I work as an AI systems engineer at GE Healthcare. So I do a lot of work with AI software implementation and integration on like a mobile X-ray device. But throughout my career, as an engineer, as a medical writer, in quality strategy, and now in systems engineering, I've always had tidbits of community experience and community engagement throughout my career. So I've always been interested in stepping away from what I'm doing at work and being involved in the community and doing more of that engagement outside of work. And over time, as I continued to do more and more and more of that, I realized what I was really interested in was community engagement and working with people outside of just the confines of like a 9-to-5 day job, right? I wanted to be more involved in community organizations, and that's how I also, connected with the Commons, Milwaukee, some of those really impactful organizations here that really stand for social change, that momentum moving forward and developing our city and things like that. And I'd say over the past year and a half, 2 years, I've also noticed that my community engagement passion has also turned into an interest in how social change occurs from a policy standpoint, and what's almost the anatomy and physiology of like making change from a government perspective or from a civic organization perspective. So I, in addition to working with Zach on Perennial Culture, I'm also a global shaper. So I'm part of the Global Shapers community, which is a subset of the World Economic Forum. And so through that organization, so it's really awesome to be connected on like a global scale, like I'm connected with all these young leaders around our age who are interested in making change in their community. And through that, I think that also sparked this interest in public policy and administration. So I'll be pursuing a graduate degree while working and doing Perennial Culture starting this fall, so that Zach and I can understand organizational change from both the corporate experiences that we have, as well as the community experiences and how policy and administration affect the culture in a community.
That's awesome. I think there's a couple points there. First of all, I also graduated as an engineer, but I don't really want to go into engineering. But when I saw you're like cultural engineer, I was like, now that's something I can get behind. So maybe offline or later on, like I would love to learn more about that. And I know I've chatted with Zach too about like design thinking and system thinking. So you guys are just like my idols. But and then I think you highlighted something really important when you want to make like lasting institutional change and when you want to change policy. I think a lot of times, especially younger generations, like they just have this passion and motivation to make change. But if you don't know how the rules work of the game, you're just going to burn out. So I think it's super important to like understand how you make policy change on like a city level, a state level, all the different, I'm sure you guys will get into it. I don't really know much, but I think it's good that you highlighted like the understanding of this if you want to actually make it.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to like what Zach and I call systems design, right? Like using systems thinking and design thinking strategies to not only understand like the problem that we see, but also like the underlying problems and associated problems and all these different causes and effects, both indirect and direct, that create more issues or like that create some kind of conflict or whatever it is. And so part of that systems thinking is understanding, like you said, the rules, right? Like sometimes you play by the rules and sometimes you really have to understand the rules before talking about them and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and even like when you talk to organizations or communities of how they're going to evolve and kind of shift their culture into maybe what they visualize for the future state of it, you start looking at intervention points, and usually the top two is the rules of the system are one of the most things that kind of hold the structure of the culture together. So if you want to change the structure of your culture, one of the biggest leverage points is the rules that govern the system. So, and then the other hand, it's the people who actually create the rules of the system. So that's why it's so important to have government entities involved with social change initiatives, or core leadership within an organization involved with the different internal corporate cultural initiatives as well. So there's that design thinking aspect of, let's make sure we understand the key problem that we're going after, but then the systematic thinking of how is this holistically affecting the culture itself.
Makes sense. I'm curious to know how each of you kind of like got to this point of putting so much importance on culture that you're like now taking it upon yourselves to help others like build culture. And whoever can start.
Well, I guess I could start. I guess so. When I came to Milwaukee, first of all, I came from Oconomowoc, which I love Oconomowoc. It was a great place to grow up, but it's a not very diverse community. and Milwaukee, on the other hand, has a number of diversities from a cultural standpoint. And I thought that was so exciting and so much more colorful and flavorful and all the different things that come with diversity. And then I started thinking of, as I kind of grew in my career at UWM, part of my role there was in charge of the faculty and the student experience of the student union building. And mainly to do that, to accomplish that goal, you have to work with, how do you bring people together from different backgrounds? How do you get different stakeholders to collaborate and come together and enhance that experience? And that was kind of like my first entry point into culture and like what culture is. And then as I kind of grew interest over the years and started kind of doing side projects in the community, I started doing like charity programs and wellness programs for companies or nonprofits. And it was like giving back programs with the aim to enhance the company culture. And what I found was I got short-term wins, people in the moment of when you do that wellness initiative or that program or that special event, energy's high. But in the long term, you don't actually see any type of cultural shift or sustainable change. So I realized that that wasn't like the end all be all solution to how you transform and evolve your culture into something more sustainable and more fulfilling. And that's kind of where I started down my journey of like, oh, there's like wellness, charity, things like that. It's just like one small element within the other things that fall into it. And then I just became obsessive with it at that point and super interested. So it's been a journey through like what I thought it was to experiencing what it wasn't to starting to really understand what it is for me, you know.
Thank you for connecting the dots there. That makes sense. And it's like, it's nice to see the journey of like reflection and understanding too. Like you don't always just jump into something and you're like, okay, cool, this works, we're gonna do it. It's like you said, that's what I thought it was. Maybe it's not this. Now I'm building this. Like kind of build your own understanding.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. I think to reiterate the question, Aneysha, I wanted to know, when did you kind of find this passion for building culture in different communities and workspaces?
Yeah, so I think my interaction with culture was very different from a very young age. So I'm an Indian American, and I think culture was first introduced to me as being multilingual, learning Hindi, learning Kashmiri, and also learning English. And then, navigating Indian traditions versus, American traditions, and Indian food versus American food, and understanding what my ethnic culture is, understanding what Indian culture is. And I'm really thankful to my parents, you know, who showed me that in a really interesting way, because I learned how to balance American culture and the way of life with being an Indian and being, you know, proud of my heritage and my culture from that perspective as well. And so culture and being and having a cultural perspective and appreciation, I think, has always been a part of my life, just in different ways throughout my life. And recently, I think last year, time is just relative. I think this was last year, but I participated in a program called CoLab. And then Zach participated in this as well. We were both in the program, just on different teams. But through this program, it was really a cultivation of Milwaukee, Startup Milwaukee, and the Commons. And they came together and created this program where ultimately we were working on community development. So we had different challenges in different segments of the community aimed at increasing or improving community engagement, community development. And there were opportunities to work with business leaders, civic leaders, organization leaders to really drive forward community change, community impact for the community members. And I think up until that point, my engagement with culture was very much like, I was interested in, you know, the United Nations Association, so I wanted to engage with them. I was interested in other, you know, social movements, and so I would engage with those, you know. But up until that point, I'd never actually, you know, dived into, okay, this is what community change, community engagement looks like. So I had the opportunity to work with, you know, architects and teachers and professors and marketers. A diverse group of people came together to create solutions for the community. And that was a really impactful experience for me, I think, because it showed me that when diverse perspectives come together to create a solution for others so that they have a better life, so that they have more opportunities, that's how you really create change. You know, that's how you really create impact. And that really, like, I remember saying, you know, to myself, if this was my job, I would be the happiest person in the world. Like, if I was doing this full time, I'd be the happiest person in the world. And that really, I think, struck a chord with me. And I realized, okay, I think this is what I'm really passionate about. You know, this is where I want to go. This is what I want to do. And I think that understanding of culture that I had in a different light from a very young age, and having these kind of community experiences and connections in Milwaukee, that really helped shape what my interest and passion for culture is today. And something that Zach and I also were engaged in. So I think we were able to reconnect earlier this year with an initiative called Cream City Stories, which was born out of the COVID-19 pandemic. So as a solution to that, we worked with, you know, the Code for Milwaukee organization to create a storytelling initiative where we could highlight, instead of, you know, the surrounding negativity and like concern, we could actually highlight positivity, optimism, and kind of put a spotlight on the hope and the change makers and the innovators in Milwaukee to help people, you know, think, yeah, there's awesome stuff going on here and we want to get involved. We want to push forward the innovation during this time when everybody, you know, really needs to come together and help each other. So Zach and I came together and worked on Cream City Stories for a while, for a couple of months. And in those conversations, we realized, you know, we were doing Cream City Stories. We were, you know, carrying forward that mission. But alongside that, we were also really passionate about creating a culture in Milwaukee around innovation, around impactful change, around sustainability. And I think that's when we decided to come together and form Perennial Culture.
Yeah, no, that collab experience was definitely a game changer for me too. And I think one thing I've always had a passion for is just like bringing people together. Like, how could I bring my different friend groups together through some party or event? Like, that's what it was in college or back in the day. And with collab, I remember the key challenge that our community district that we were targeted on was having was kind of each different stakeholder had same goals and things that they wanted to accomplish, but none of them were working together. They were all working in their own separate directions. And as we started like learning about that, and I kind of took my cultural lens into this play, I was like, whoa, like culture is the ultimate bonding agent between different stakeholders. Like it is the ultimate glue between different elements within the system, right? Like the different stakeholders within the community that can ultimately, if it's done correctly, like you design the system correct in the right way, it can bring people together and unite them towards a bigger cause, whatever that is, whatever that social change movement is, or even within a company, it's different departments being bonded together over the mission of the company. So it's, I think we just both have a passion to bring people together and like unite people over some purpose-driven initiative, and culture is the ultimate energy between those other kind of elements, if you will.
That's a great connection and call up that you guys were able to see. So Zach, I know that, so you said you've been working on Perennial HD for a few years. How did that transition from Perennial HD to now Perennial Culture, and like what has happened?
Yeah. Man, I sometimes it's hard to even think. So I think where things get started from, right? Like all of a sudden you're just in it and you don't really know where it ever began sometimes. But
it was maybe this conversation or this networking event or this,
yeah,
like, where did the idea start? Like the very beginning?
Yeah. So man, that's tough. So
I asked tough questions.
Well, the human development piece was a big part of what I wanted to do at the time. And I think I really, at the time, like I was more focused on the individual level than the collective systematic level, like working with corporations, nonprofits, and communities, where at that time, I just really wanted to dial into how individuals could develop into stronger culture champions, if you will, and improve their own lives so they could live more of a full life of purpose and fulfillment, and utilize culture as a wedge point for them to get there. So if I could arm people to take control and develop their own lives and empower them at the individual level, I think my vision was that would ripple into larger change within the community. And that was great, but I think after I learned a lot and got involved in different initiatives, that's still part of what Aneysha and I do, like part of Perennial Culture, the next iteration or evolution of what Perennial HD was. Like we still need to help and coach individuals on how they can become culture champions, but we also need to help them be more strategic and see the system holistically so they understand their role within it, where I think that big piece of that like holistic view, how is your interactions actually affecting other parts of it, and affecting the system as a whole, that piece was missing in the first iteration, which I think is essential to the success of it. So yeah, it's crazy to think about though, how that even got started, you know.
Oh, thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
And then, so what made you guys kind of take this next step or evolution of Perennial?
Well, I don't even know how that started either.
It's not linear. I'm just saying.
I was like,
it just happened.
Yeah, did Aneysha like call me and say something? Did I call her about this and say like we should talk? I don't know. I actually don't know how that started, but
it was just so awesome that it just happened, and
I think so. It was pretty.
It just kind of happened.
Yeah.
Like we both were.
Just put together a website. I don't know how that just kind of happened.
It
looks good.
Perennialculture.com, no plug, but
done.
But yeah, well, we met each other in collab, which was a year or more ago, who knows, but that might have been 2 years ago now that I think about it, because I feel like they did another one. But we met through that, and we weren't on the same team, but we kind of knew each other. And then through Code for Milwaukee, through some of the civic solutions Saturdays they were doing in response to the coronavirus, we got paired up on the same team. And I think just her mindset from her engineering background and be able to think more critically, systematically on things, and more of my background in maybe the business design space and the design thinking space, we kind of just started applying those in Cream City Stories and organically formed cultural system design. You know, it was like, it kind of grew on its own, which was kind of cool. But yeah, I don't really know how it actually, like, if like we had a one-on-one meeting one day, I don't even remember that, but yeah, I don't know.
Oh, that's awesome. So could you guys tell me just about Perennial Culture and like what your mission is now and what you're hoping to do in the next coming weeks?
Yeah, so Perennial Culture is basically a social enterprise organization. And what we're aiming to do is we want to empower organizations, teams, people to create sustainable cultural evolution. So we want to be able to see cultural evolution occur in organizations, but we want to give them actionable systems design methods to create that kind of sustainable change and impact social and cultural change. And so ultimately, what we envision is, given the ability for organizations to create this kind of sustainable change over time that improves and improves and improves, ultimately creating self-organizing cultures. So self-developing, self-progressing cultures where that sustainability that's within the organization, it just continues pushing the organization forward, so that they develop, you know, better culture, better methods, whatever their mission is, it just pushes that forward.
Yeah. And even to build off that, we hear the term like cultural transformation in the industry a lot, like put your company through cultural transformation. And that implies that there's an ending to it, right? Like you start and you end when you're transformed, and that's not sustainable because it needs to be this like self-organized, evolutionary, reoccurring thing. And that's part of why we even picked the word perennial. If anyone's familiar with the word perennial, it's usually like the plant, right? Like they think of the perennial plants that every year they grow back, and every year they grow back stronger, and they kind of sustain over the long term. And we see culture development and evolution to be the same way. Like you should continuously design and manage your culture like it's this breathing ecosystem of elements. It's a continuous process. You're always kind of looking at it, empathizing with it, empowering it, and all those different things. Over time, it's never ending. So we've developed a process, a culture system design process. It's essentially 5 stages, and each stage takes you through how do you understand from a design thinking standpoint what the key problems or challenges or areas of your culture do you need to look at. And then you start to empower the system and your people with tools to be able to maybe bridge the gap between where you are today to where you need to go. And then the kind of the ending phase is that breathing evolutionary part of like bringing you through that continuously. So after like a company goes through that process, they should feel, or a company, organization, any entity really, they should feel empowered to be able to control, manage, and sustain their culture over the long haul, forever, essentially. So that's what we're trying to do. Like that's what we have been doing, and what we're trying to grow into is more in the community today. So
I love that you brought up the point that like transformation has a beginning and end, but with Perennial, like you're so right, it doesn't stop. Like time keeps going, things are changing, new people join the company, new leadership happens, and so like there needs to be like adaptation and another, you know, we're constantly like empathizing and looking in. So that's a great point. I have the question of, have you guys had any pushback from companies? Like say if you're like pitching this to somebody or a company if they push back or kind of just like no, and if so, like how did you deal with that? Like personally, like how did you feel, and also I don't know, what did you do next?
Yes, there is a lot of pushback, definitely.
I figured.
Typically, if an organization has a bad culture, it's because leadership doesn't see it as a priority in most cases. And when you're trying to win leadership over and implementing a program like this, they don't think it's a priority to begin with. So yeah, there is constant pushback. There's constant objections of thinking you don't have a lot of time. Like some people are in fight or flight mode constantly, and they don't think they have time to dedicate into something like this, where essentially this would help the well-being of their flight or fight mode and take them out of that reactionary type mental model that they have. So yeah, it's tough. I'll let Aneysha speak to some of the ways she does it, but I also think like I work with the people that are on board with it. I try to win over the people that are neutral, and the people that are against it, I don't waste my time because eventually they become irrelevant anyway. So the cultural systems in the world are changing whether you want it to or not. Like it happens. And do you want to be intentional about it, or do you want to just let it happen to you? So that's something I would say to anyone that's like not being proactive about it or thinking about it. Like it's going to happen. Like culture changes. It's self-organizing to begin with. Do you want to be able to manage it and design it proactively with intention? Or do you want it to control you and decide ultimately your success in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with Zach. You know, what he's saying is absolutely correct. And just to add on to that, you know, right now, if we look at what corporations and organizations are doing today with their culture, there are a lot of organizations who are involved in cultural design programs, leadership programs, and different things that they do to get their employees engaged in, you know, developing their culture and trying to have committees and trying to build that sense of progress or that culture of progress, right? But ultimately, what they're doing is exactly what Zach said, right? It's a sign of cultural transformation, not necessarily sustainable change. And so in looking at culture and what it is and how it's currently built, Zach and I realized that the way organizations build their culture is kind of like how product development teams build a product, right? Culture is almost designed as, okay, these are our requirements, we're going to validate it, and boom, perfectly packaged culture, right? Like it's almost built like a product. And the reality is that this has been the mental model throughout time, right? This has been the stereotype. And we're here to question and break that stereotype. Because the reality is, culture is not a product. It's a product of your environment. It's a result of the interactions, indirect and direct, of the environment that you're in. And that includes the people, that includes the leadership, that includes, you know, person-to-person interactions. And it also includes policy, general environment, climate, all of those different things. All of those different things influence what culture is. And so we can't just design culture from top down. We really have to work together and collaboratively co-create culture, because it's the result of what we put together and what we put in, and the culture is what we get out of that, right? Like as an engineer, I think of inputs and outputs and a process.
I had a feeling you would say that.
And I guess that's where the cultural engineering comes in, right? Like it's a very design oriented thing. Culture is what comes out of all these different inputs, how they interact in this system, and how and what comes out of it. And whether that culture is good, whether it's bad, all of that is dependent on how it was designed in the environment that it was in, what influenced it, what impacted it. And so we're here to change that mental model. We're here to create that cultural mindset shift, because that's really what's needed in order to actually progress culture and think about culture in a different way. So we're here to work with organizations who want to embrace culture and embrace cultural improvement. And I think that there is a lot of hesitation, there is a lot of pushback, but ultimately it's almost like groupthink, right? Like in psychology, we say, well, if one person does it, maybe like 2 other people and 3 other people and 5 other people will do it too, So if we create that cultural shift and that social cultural change shift and importance, we shed light on that in a small city or a small setting, then based on our model, based on that system design, more and more organizations should be able to flock towards that, the success and the progress that they see. And they should also want to engage in that. And they should also think, oh yeah, I prioritize my culture. I really care about how my employees are doing, right? Like I care about how my board as a nonprofit's performing and what their decision-making ability is like. And so I also want to engage that culture and progress that culture and make it better. So I think given that groupthink model and given that psychology of how people and organizations think and interact, we want to create that model. We want to create that example of good culture and cultural shift and social change so that more organizations, be it nonprofits, companies, whatever it is, will follow. And, ultimately we create that self-organizing system of culture.
Yeah. Yeah. And even like build off of that, I always think about like where's the market at in the maturity of this space? And I think we're not fully developed, like mature wise in this type of approach where like she was talking before, like a lot of business owners or leaders want culture. When people like us come in, they're like, hey, can you just like package up culture and like plug it in and let's go? And that's what they think about it as. Like it's this wellness program, it's a leadership development program, it's a special event, a town hall, or a new office building. And those things all can play into your culture, but it will never have the sustainable long-term impact that they're actually looking for. So it definitely takes some education on the front end for us to kind of teach them a little bit about, it's not this product, I can't just plug it in, it must be co-created with your people. And there's a process that you can go through to do that. So definitely educating them. But I also, as Aneysha talked about, I think there's a lot of opportunity. People are starting to mature and understand that culture is not a product. It's actually this more systematic energy. And we have to start leaning into that if we want to be sustainable over the long term. And then I think as success starts to happen and this kind of approach becomes more validated in the market, people naturally are going to come in on board. They're going to have to. And we're even part of another big group called Culture First, and it's a culture initiative, a global initiative that's being run by Culture Amp, and we're leading the Milwaukee chapter. So we talk with different chapters all over the world at this point. And this is the approach. Like this is what's working. This is what research is showing as a successful and proven way to actually transform and evolve your culture over the long haul. So we feel very confident about this and excited to start bringing it to our direct community. But there definitely is still some like hesitation of like, oh, this is a little new. I don't like always like new stuff, and change. And so you got to deal with that, that vulnerability and help them be a little more courageous and I can hold them a little bit through the process.
That actually leads into my last question pretty well. I was going to ask each of you, what is maybe like a piece of advice or the first thing that you would tell somebody if they're like nervous or abrasive towards like building or co-creating a culture? What's like the first thing that you would say to them to kind of like get them into that acceptance phase?
So I'd say that the first element of even beginning that culture journey it starts with empathy. I think empathy is, and is essentially establishing the human connection, right, between two people, understanding that person's values, that person's mission, that person's purpose in life. So any kind of discussion about culture is essentially going to come down to and start with a sense of empathy, a sense of understanding, a sense of wanting to get to know the other person, wanting to get to know what drives them, what's their purpose, what makes them feel good, what makes them feel empowered, right? Because only through empathy can we actually empower somebody. Through that empowerment, we're able to understand. That really reflects the fact that we understand them, we know how they think, we know how they work, and we know what kind of environment that they're in. And given all of that, we can co-create some kind of solution with them so that they feel empowered. They can take it on themselves, they understand a vision, and they can go and make a change, right? They can go into the community and say, yes, I feel empowered, I want to do this. So I think at the end of the day, the first step is establishing that human connection, establishing and being an empath, being and relating to somebody else's core, relating to somebody else's values, and recognizing that purpose. And it may be different, right? But empathy ultimately comes down to having a sense of vulnerability, having a sense of acceptance. In today's community, diversity and inclusion has become such an important aspect of any kind of organization. And even diversity and inclusion, as important as it is, cannot be fully achieved. It cannot be fully accepted, or cannot be fully created with impact unless you start with empathy. Empathy is the root of that. And so I think in order to create any kind of culture, any kind of first step, you need to embrace and practice empathy.
Yeah. And I totally agree 100% on that. And I think even just a simple way to do that, and is definitely a workshop or activity that we do in the beginning stages. But is as simple as pulling diverse levels of people in the organization at different levels in the hierarchy and different areas department wise, and just get into a room together, I guess virtual now, to have a real conversation, so you can have that human connection, so you can understand their view on it. Because I think what a lot of leaders do, or just people in general do, is they apply their perspective of what the system or what the culture is, which is valid in their sense, right? If that's their perspective, that's what's real. But there's also other diverse perspectives that actually create the reality of what it is. So it could be as simple as create a safe space to have a real conversation that involves vulnerability and courage. Ask some real questions of what is your perspective on what X is, and then put it on the table. And that's where you start literally uncovering what the actual mental models and the viewpoints and the perspectives are of the culture. And if I was someone within an organization, I'm just a new employee or mid-level manager, I would start within my own team and doing that. I would start going to my peers. I'll try to get some type of executive sponsor from the leadership team, and just bring it up. And that's part of kind of the beginning, right? Culture champion, that's that role, that you can take. And it's going to take a little bit of courage, but just creating that safe space to bring people together, that's a great first step.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for being culture champions and for sharing with us today, the great things that you're doing. I really appreciate your perspectives, and I'm excited to see how you continue, especially in this new world of, online and remote. That's a whole different culture. So I'm excited to see how you guys tackle that.
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
thank you for having us.
Yeah.